Hello and welcome. My name's Travis Miner, and I am here with educational consultant Dana Roth to answer some questions that families might have about how to secure accommodations for their students in college. Dana, who is an expert of answering these types of questions, I'm hoping you can help us understand some of these common queries that families might have. First off, what can you tell us a little bit about what are accommodations? What sort of accommodations might a student receive in college?
Absolutely. So accommodations are typically provided to students who have a diagnosis of some kind of disability. That can be a learning disability, ADHD, an anxiety disorder, another mental health condition. It can also pertain to a sensory diagnosis, such as blindness or deafness, or a physical disability. Um, Additionally, we're also seeing a number of health concerns, so things like Crohn's or colitis. And so those are also areas where students would be eligible for receiving accommodations based on their history and the ways in which their diagnosis impacts their daily living.
That's really helpful to know. So it's a broader spectrum than maybe we might initially think of. Um, can you give any examples of what some accommodations might look like for a student?
Absolutely. So many accommodations are available that students typically will receive in high school. They'll also be available for students in college. So that can include things like extended time on exams, reduced distraction test taking, access to professors' notes in advance of class to help with note taking. There might be a scribe available or other note taking services like recording a class lecture so that students can listen to that recording later. There also, in some cases, there might be instances where students could have extensions on assignments or excused absences, depending on what a student's diagnosis is and again, how it impacts them on a day-to-day basis.
And if a family is seeking some of these accommodations for their students, what sort of documentation do they typically need to provide to the school? Is that who they're giving the documentation to? What does that look like?
Absolutely. So, what's tricky is that sometimes families will wonder whether to share that documentation in a student's admission file in their actual application. And this varies from student to student and school to school and is really an independent and unique um, discussion and decision for the student to make. However, in terms of the general process, when students are deciding to matriculate to a college, they would reach out oftentimes, almost always, to the Disability Services Office, which has all different names. Some colleges will call it Disability Services, some will call it Student Accessibility, some will call it Disability Resources. Usually, a quick Google search for disability services and your specific college will get you to the right office, even if they use different terminology. And you'll share your documentation, which can include a medical diagnosis. It could include a neuropsychological report. It could include other materials based on what your specific diagnosis is. You'll always check that with your college in particular, because every college has different requirements that they are looking for. They'll have different requirements for how old or how recent documentation will be. And so deferring to the individual college will be a great way to set you up for success.
So it sounds like if somebody has documentation from maybe when they were in eighth grade, they had a neuropsych evaluation. It sounds like that's something that doesn't necessarily translate, or when should families be thinking about updating their documentation in anticipation of the college process?
Great question. The most recent documentation is generally preferred, even if a college is looser on what their specific requirements are. So, oftentimes, having updated documentation, updated neuropsych evaluations, for example, in summer going into 12th grade or going into college, even would be the best. That will really set the student up to be successful, to only have to hopefully submit their documentation once rather than having an update in the middle of their college experience. And hopefully it might even carry over for grad work or a professional degree if that's something that students are considering.
That's an interesting consideration. It sounds like making sure that documentation is updated and all clearly organized is sort of can add that to the checklist of things to make sure that the student has and does before they're headed off to college.
Absolutely, 100% agree. It's very much something that I encourage students to do, to make sure that the schools to which they're applying or that they end up attending are going to have the most up-to-date information.
For students who have received accommodations in high school, I'm sure this varies by college, but generally speaking, does it seem like the accommodations they had in high school are nearly identical to what they receive in college? Do colleges tend to be more accommodating, less accommodating?
It depends. So generally speaking, accommodations from high school to college will be probably fairly similar. And what I mean by that is if you had time and a half for extended time on tests, you will likely receive time and a half in college as well, provided that your documentation supports that accommodation. However, with modifications to a student's curriculum, so for example, if a student had the opportunity to have fewer multiple choice options on a multiple choice test, so instead of choosing from 5 options, you were only choosing from 3, that is generally not going to be considered an appropriate accommodation because it would be modifying the actual assessment, which would be seen as getting in the way of a professor's academic freedom, which gets to a trickier point, which is probably for another interview.
Interesting. That sounds like that could get very complicated very
Yes.
quickly.
Yes. But
Um,
generally it does tend to resemble what students receive in high school. However, it's not, if you have a 504 plan, for example, you simply bring that from high school to college and the college says, sure, we'll put all of these in place.
and so in talking to the college, it sounds like it would be important for a family to connect with disability services or the equivalent division at the college. When and how should a family reach out to make that connection and sort of have that conversation about what this might look like for their student?
Great question. This can be done at a bunch of different times throughout a search process and decision-making process. So for many students, during a visit to campus, it can be a really helpful opportunity to connect with disability services, to see where they're located on campus, to learn who typically staffs the office. Is it an office of one? Are there 4 different people, or 8 or 12 or 15 people, depending on the size of the school? Where is it located on campus? Is it super easy to get to? And so you can get there in the library or in the student center? Or is it kind of tucked away in a little corner on campus? There isn't a good or bad. It's just feeling out what makes the most sense for you as a student. But certainly during your first visit to campus, it's a great opportunity to familiarize yourself with the office. Even if you don't actually meet with them at that time, you can always follow up and have a Zoom call with someone or a phone call with someone to learn more about the process. But it's really something that is important to include in your search overall so that you know, am I looking for a school where I'm going to have one point person and they're my person and I reach out to them with any questions? Is it going to be an office where you're kind of not bounced around, but you have the opportunity to connect with all different folks in the office? Maybe different people have different responsibilities within the office, and so you work differently with different folks. So these are great things to think about so that students can really consider what works best for them. There's all different options. There's no one right answer. It's really just thinking about how this ties in with overall fit for the student. You can also connect after the admissions process. So for example, if you are deciding between 4 different colleges and you want to make sure that you'll receive your accommodations that you need in order to access your materials in class and out of class, because we're focusing on access, not success in college. And that's a big shift as well. But connecting with disability services at that time, in that, January to May timeline of senior year, is a really great opportunity as well to really dive into the nitty gritty. Will I feel welcome in this office? Will there be people who I know I can connect with? What is the process for requesting accommodations at this specific school? And how does that work for me? How successful do I think I will be with those different opportunities?
That is so helpful. I love your suggestion too of finding the physical office the first time you're on campus. I imagine that provides great reassurance to students to say, I know exactly where to go if I need this help.
Yeah. I especially love when offices are located very, very easily. So for example, my bias is that they're in a student center, they're in a library located close by other offices, other resources on campus, so that they're just seen as one of many resources for students on a college campus, rather than thinking about more of a medical model of disability services where it's fixing a problem. We're really not looking to fix a problem. We're looking to empower students with disability services.
Yeah, it seems like the location would say a lot about how the school is approaching it. That's so helpful.
Yeah.
So you suggested some great questions that a student might be, the whole family may be asking themselves about, is this the right fit? Will I receive the support that's appropriate? When the family or the student is actually talking with someone from disability services, are there any specific questions you'd encourage them to ask to get a better sense of, is this a place that's going to help me have the access that I need to thrive here?
Absolutely. Things that are helpful to think about in advance that connect more on the self-reflective level can be really helpful. So for example, for the student to ask themselves, or even better, to have a conversation with your parents. I know that gets a little tricky sometimes, but having a conversation between student and parent, or even student and success person at their high school, to think about, how have I been successful? What has allowed me to be successful? And what do I think I'll need to continue that success in college? So does that include having access to a fee-based program where I'm connecting with one learning specialist on a weekly basis, and my family is paying for that service to know that we have that support in place? Does that mean I want to make sure that there's tutoring on campus, so that if I have a hard math class my first semester, I know where to go, I know how to access that? Is that something that's included in the price, or is that something that I'm paying for outside? And thinking about what the accommodations are that students most often are receiving in high school, and what they will need in their college experience, to really narrow down what those questions are. With some self-reflection, it can really help to inform those questions. But in general, you can certainly think about who is staffing the office. What's the overall vibe that you get? Because if you feel like, and I do mean that very genuinely, if you feel like when you go into the office, you're put off, you're not necessarily feeling welcome, as silly as it might sound, it really matters, because if you don't feel welcome somewhere, you're probably not going to make use of the services. And if you're not making use of the services, you're probably not accessing what you need to make sure that you have the accommodations in place. So those are some big pieces that can be super helpful when you actually visit. And also thinking about what kinds of accommodations are often available. Usually we see that a standard set of accommodations will be available to students. It'll just sort of depend on how they affect a student's success and access in particular, to make the environment as accessible as possible.
This is such helpful information. I really appreciate that suggestion of a vibe check, because it's tough to put into words, but yeah, how do you feel when you're there? Like, yeah. It might look great on paper, but it really does matter what that experience actually feels like to be in that office.
Yeah.
Dana, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. If families want to learn more about some of these types of questions or reach you to help support their student, what's the best way for them to be in touch?
Thanks so much for asking. Thanks so much for having me as well, Travis. My website is danarotheducationalconsulting.com. My email is Dana Rose Roth, so 12 letters, at gmail.com. And that's typically the best way. I'm also on Instagram at Dana Roth Consulting. You can see some fun college tour pictures on there, which could also be fun for students and parents alike.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Dana.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.